Welcome to a sanctuary of stories, a place where ancient wisdom meets modern peace, where each tale carries you deeper into tranquility and understanding. Tonight, you've found your way to a collection unlike any other, 500 carefully chosen stories designed to guide you into the most restful sleep and profound meditation you've ever experienced. As you settle into comfort, allow your breathing to find its natural rhythm. Feel your shoulders release their tension, your jaw soften, and your mind begin to quiet. These stories have been gathered from across cultures and centuries, each one selected not just for its beauty, but for its power to transform restlessness into serenity, worry into wonder. In a world that moves too quickly, that demands too much, that offers too little time for reflection, these stories create a different space entirely. Here, time moves at the pace of wisdom. Here, your spirit can rest while your mind explores landscapes of meaning and peace. Each story is a doorway, each word a gentle guide leading you away from the day's concerns and into the realm of deep, restorative rest. The tradition of storytelling for healing and rest stretches back to humanity's earliest days. Around ancient fires, beneath star-filled skies, in quiet chambers lit by flickering candles, stories have always been medicine for the restless heart and the worried mind. Tonight, we continue that tradition, weaving together narratives that speak to the deepest parts of who you are. Our first story takes us to a hidden valley, where an old gardener discovers something extraordinary about the nature of patience and the secret rhythm that governs all growing things. The Garden of Impossible Seasons. In a remote valley tucked between towering mountains, where morning mist lingered long into the afternoon and streams sang their way down from glacial heights, there lived a gardener named Elias. For 47 years, he had tended the same plot of earth, watching seasons cycle through their eternal dance, learning the particular needs of every plant under his care. Elias was known throughout the nearby villages for his extraordinary gardens. Travelers would detour from their journeys just to walk his pathways and marvel at flowers that bloomed more vibrantly than anywhere else, vegetables that grew sweeter and larger than seemed possible, and fruit trees that bore their gifts with such abundance that he shared them freely with anyone who passed by. But what made Elias truly remarkable wasn't just the beauty of his gardens. It was his profound understanding of time itself and how patience could transform even the most stubborn seed into something magnificent. One autumn morning, as golden leaves drifted down like memories made visible, a young woman named Sarah arrived at his garden gate. She carried with her a small canvas bag and an expression of deep frustration that seemed at odds with the peaceful morning. Elias was kneeling beside a bed of late-blooming chrysanthemums, his weathered hands gentle as he removed spent flowers to encourage new growth. He looked up as Sarah approached, noting the tension in her posture and the way her eyes darted restlessly across the garden, as if searching for something specific. "Good morning," Elias said, his voice carrying the calm warmth that came from decades of working with growing things. "You seem troubled, young traveler. Perhaps the garden might offer what you're seeking." "What?" Sarah shifted the bag on her shoulder, and Elias could hear the soft rattle of seeds within. "I've heard about your gardens," she said, her words coming quickly. "People say you can make anything grow, that you understand secrets others don't. I've been trying to start my own garden for 3 years now, and nothing works. Nothing grows the way it should." She opened her bag to reveal dozens of small packets, seeds collected from far and wide. "I've tried everything. Different soils, different locations, following every instruction I could find. But my plants either die quickly or grow so slowly that I give up before they have a chance to establish themselves." Elias rose slowly, brushing soil from his knees. "Show me how you plant," he said simply. Sarah looked around the garden, then selected an empty patch of earth. From her bag, she pulled out a packet of sunflower seeds. Her movements were quick and efficient as she prepared the soil, measured the spacing, and placed the seeds with mathematical precision. "How long before they sprout?" she asked before she had even finished covering the last seed. Elias smiled gently. Tell me, Sarah, what do you do while waiting for your seeds to germinate? I check them every day, she replied immediately. Sometimes twice a day. I want to make sure they're not drying out, or getting too much water, or being bothered by pests. I dig around them carefully to see if they're starting to sprout yet. The old gardener nodded thoughtfully. And when do you usually give up on a planting? Sarah's cheeks flushed slightly. Well, if nothing happens after a week or two, I figure the seeds were bad or I did something wrong. There's no point in wasting time on something that clearly isn't working. Elias walked over to a magnificent oak tree that stood at the center of his garden, its trunk so wide that 3 people holding hands couldn't encircle it. This tree, he said, placing his palm against its bark, was planted by my grandfather when he was younger than you are now. He never saw it reach even half its current height. He gestured to a nearby bed where tiny green shoots were just beginning to emerge from the soil. Those carrots were planted 6 weeks ago. The first sign of life appeared only last week. Sarah looked confused. But surely vegetables grow faster than trees. Some do, some don't, Elias agreed. But that's not the point. The point is that every growing thing has its own relationship with time. Your impatience isn't helping your plants grow faster. It's preventing you from understanding the natural rhythms that govern all life. He began walking slowly through the garden, and Sarah followed. When I plant a seed, Elias continued, I plant it with complete faith that it will do what seeds do. I don't dig it up to check its progress. I don't worry that it's taking too long. I simply provide the conditions it needs and trust the process. They paused beside a patch of earth that looked completely barren. What do you see here? Elias asked. Nothing, Sarah said. Empty ground. Look again, he encouraged. This ground is resting. Last season, it grew the most abundant crop of tomatoes you've ever seen. Now it's gathering strength for next year's planting. The soil is composting fallen leaves. Earthworms are enriching it. Beneficial bacteria are multiplying. To call this nothing is to misunderstand the nature of growth itself. Sarah knelt down and touched the earth, feeling its rich, loamy texture. I never thought of rest as part of the growing process. Most people don't, Elias replied. We live in a world that equates activity with progress, that mistakes busyness for productivity. But the deepest growth often happens in the quiet times, in the spaces between visible changes. They continued walking, and Elias pointed out plants at various stages of development. Here, bulbs that wouldn't show any sign of life until spring. There, perennials that appeared dead but were storing energy in their roots through the winter months. Everywhere, examples of growth that couldn't be rushed, couldn't be forced, but could be trusted. The secret isn't in making plants grow faster, Elias explained. It's in learning to move at the speed of growth itself. When you plant with impatience, you're fighting against the natural order. When you plant with faith and patience, you become part of the process. As they walked, Sarah began to notice things she had missed before. The way certain areas of the garden seemed to be in conversation with each other, with plants supporting and protecting their neighbors. The careful placement of stones and paths that seemed to follow the natural contours of the land. The subtle signs of animal life that indicated a healthy ecosystem. How do you know when something is really failing versus just taking its time? Sarah asked. Elias stopped beside a small fruit tree that looked somewhat sparse compared to others nearby. This apple tree hasn't produced fruit in 3 years, he said. Someone impatient might have removed it by now, thinking it was a failure. He pointed to the base of the tree where Sarah could now see new growth emerging. But look here. The tree has been putting all its energy into establishing strong roots. Next spring, it will likely produce its first substantial crop. The waiting wasn't wasted time, it was necessary preparation. They spent the afternoon walking through different sections of the garden, each area teaching its own lesson about the relationship between patience and growth. The herb spiral where aromatic plants created a microclimate for each other. The wildflower meadow that looked chaotic, but followed deep patterns of succession and mutual support. The vegetable beds where careful timing and companion planting created abundance without force. As the sun began to set, painting the garden in golden hues, they returned to where Sarah had planted her sunflower seeds that morning. The earth looked exactly the same as when she had covered the seeds, and Sarah felt her old impatience beginning to stir. Elias noticed her expression. "Tell me what you're thinking," he said gently. "I'm already wondering if I did something wrong," Sarah admitted. "I know it's been only a few hours, but I feel this urge to dig one up and check if it's starting to germinate." "That feeling," Elias said, "is exactly what has been preventing your success. Every time you disturb a seed to check its progress, you interrupt the delicate process of germination. Every time you give up after a week or two, you abandon the process just as it's beginning to work." He knelt beside the freshly planted area and placed his hand gently on the soil. "Right now, beneath this earth, those seeds are absorbing moisture. Their outer shells are beginning to soften. Root tips are starting to emerge. None of this is visible to us, but it's happening with perfect precision according to the seed's own inner wisdom." Sarah knelt beside him, placing her own hand on the cool earth. "How long will it really take?" "Sunflower seeds typically germinate in 7 to 14 days under good conditions," Elias replied. "But germination is just the beginning. The plant will spend weeks developing its root system before putting significant energy into the growth you can see above ground. The first flowers might not appear for 2 to 3 months." "That seems like such a long time," Sarah said. Elias smiled. "And yet, think of what's being accomplished in that time. A tiny seed, smaller than your thumbnail, is transforming itself into a plant that might grow 8 feet tall and produce hundreds of new seeds. Can you imagine any human project that achieves such transformation in such a short time?" They sat in comfortable silence as darkness began to gather around them. The garden took on a different character in the evening light, more mysterious, more alive with the subtle movements of nocturnal creatures and the whispered conversations of plants adjusting to the cooling air. "I have a confession," Sarah said finally. "I think I became interested in gardening because I wanted to have control over something. My life feels chaotic, unpredictable. I thought if I could make plants grow exactly when and how I wanted, it would give me a sense of mastery." Elias nodded understanding. "The garden teaches us the opposite of control," he said. "It teaches us partnership, cooperation, trust in processes larger than ourselves. When you try to control a garden, it resists. When you learn to work with it, it becomes generous beyond measure." As the stars began to appear overhead, Elias led Sarah to a small wooden bench positioned to overlook the entire garden. From this vantage point, she could see how the different areas flowed together, creating a unified whole that felt both planned and perfectly natural. "There's something else I want to share with you," Elias said, his voice taking on the quality of someone preparing to reveal a deeper truth. "The most important lesson the garden has taught me isn't about plants at all. It's about the nature of faith itself." He gestured toward the moonlit landscape before them. "Every gardener must make the same leap of faith, season after season. We place seeds in the earth knowing we cannot see what happens next. We water ground that appears empty, trusting that life is stirring beneath the surface. We tend spaces that look barren, believing in transformations we cannot yet witness." Sarah pulled her shawl closer against the cooling night air. "But what if the faith is misplaced? What if some seeds really are meant to fail?" "Even failure teaches us," Elias replied thoughtfully. "A seed that doesn't germinate tells us something about the soil, the timing, or the conditions. But more often than not, What we interpret as failure is simply growth happening on a timeline we don't understand or can't perceive. He pointed toward a section of the garden that lay in deep shadow. 3 years ago, I planted a grove of fruit trees in that area. For 2 full seasons, they showed almost no growth above ground. I began to doubt my choice of location, wondering if the soil was too poor or the drainage inadequate. But in their 3rd spring, they suddenly burst into vigorous growth. I learned later that they had spent those quiet years developing root systems that now support the most productive trees in my entire garden. The night air carried the scent of jasmine and cooling earth, creating an atmosphere of deep tranquility. Sarah found herself breathing more slowly, her earlier urgency dissolving into something softer and more sustainable. "I think I've been approaching my whole life the way I approach gardening," she said quietly. "Expecting immediate results, getting frustrated when things don't happen on my schedule, giving up when progress isn't visible." Elias nodded with the gentle recognition of someone who had witnessed this realization many times before. The garden mirrors life in more ways than we often realize. Both require patience, faith, and the wisdom to distinguish between our desire for control and our capacity for nurturing. They sat in companionable silence, listening to the subtle night sounds of the garden. An owl called from somewhere in the oak tree. Small creatures rustled through the undergrowth. The stream continued its eternal conversation with the stones. "Will you teach me?" Sarah asked finally. "Not just about gardening, but about this kind of patience. This way of trusting processes I can't see." "The garden will teach you," Elias replied. "I can only show you how to listen to what it's already trying to tell you. But yes, if you're willing to stay and learn at the pace of growing things, there's much to discover here." Over the following weeks, Sarah remained in the valley, learning not just the practical skills of cultivation, but the deeper arts of observation and patience. Each morning, she would check the area where she had planted the sunflower seeds, fighting the urge to disturb the soil while learning to notice subtler signs of life awakening. Elias taught her to read the garden like a book, showing her how the color of leaves revealed the health of plants, how the behavior of beneficial insects indicated the balance of the ecosystem, how the timing of different bloomings created a seasonal symphony of color and fragrance. But perhaps more importantly, he taught her to sit with uncertainty, to water areas of the garden that showed no visible signs of life, to trust in processes that moved according to their own ancient wisdom rather than human schedules. On the 14th day after planting, Sarah discovered the first tiny green shoots pushing through the soil where her sunflower seeds lay buried. The sight filled her with a joy disproportionate to such a small event, but she understood now that she wasn't just celebrating the emergence of plants. She was celebrating her own growing capacity to trust in things beyond her immediate perception. "They're so small," she marveled to Elias, who had come to witness this milestone with her. "Yes," he agreed, "but notice how perfectly formed they are. Each one carries within it the complete blueprint for the towering plant it will become. This is the miracle we witness every time we have faith in the invisible processes of growth." As summer progressed, Sarah learned to tend not just individual plants, but the relationships between them. She discovered how certain flowers attracted beneficial insects that protected the vegetables, how specific herbs could enhance the growth of nearby plants, how the careful placement of taller species could provide shade and wind protection for more delicate varieties. Her sunflowers grew steadily, their broad leaves tracking the sun's path across the sky, their stalks thickening and stretching toward their eventual magnificent height. But Sarah found herself less fixated on their progress and more absorbed in the daily rhythms of the garden as a whole. She learned the art of morning observation, walking the pathways with Elias as the first light revealed overnight changes in the landscape, a bud that had opened, a vine that had found new support, beneficial predators that had arrived to address pest problems naturally. Each day brought subtle transformations that would have been invisible to her former impatient eye. The practice of gardening became a form of meditation, teaching her to be present with processes that unfolded according to their own inherent timing. She discovered that her anxiety about outcomes diminished as her appreciation for the present moment deepened. By midsummer, when her sunflowers stood tall with faces the size of dinner plates turned toward the sky, Sarah realized that the transformation in the garden was matched by a transformation in herself. The restless urgency that had driven her for so long had been replaced by something steadier and more sustainable. "I understand now," she told Elias one evening as they walked among the mature plants. "The garden wasn't just teaching me about growing flowers and vegetables. It was teaching me about growing as a person." Elias smiled, pleased with her insight. Every gardener discovers this eventually. We think we're cultivating plants, but the garden is cultivating us. It teaches us patience, humility, faith in processes beyond our control, and the deep satisfaction that comes from working in partnership with life itself. As autumn approached and the garden began its preparation for the dormant season, Sarah understood that she too was entering a new phase of her journey. The frantic seeking that had brought her to this valley had been replaced by a quieter confidence, a trust in her own capacity to grow and change, according to natural rhythms rather than forced timelines. The sunflowers had completed their cycle, their heavy heads now filled with seeds that would carry the potential for countless new generations. Sarah carefully harvested some for next year's planting, marveling at how the tiny seeds she had planted with such anxiety had multiplied into abundance. "What will you do now?" Elias asked as she prepared to continue her travels. "I'll plant gardens wherever I go," Sarah replied. "But more than that, I'll carry this understanding with me. This knowledge that growth happens in its own time, that faith in invisible processes can sustain us through uncertainty, that patience isn't passive waiting, but active partnership with the natural rhythms of life." As she walked away from the valley, carrying her bag of seeds and her hard-won wisdom, Sarah felt herself moving at a different pace. Not the hurried rush of someone trying to force outcomes, but the steady, sustainable rhythm of someone who had learned to trust in the timing of growing things. The garden had taught her its greatest secret: that true cultivation requires not just the planting of seeds in soil, but the planting of faith in the heart, trusting that what cannot yet be seen is already in the process of becoming. The sound of water over stones grew fainter as Sarah made her way down the mountain path, but the rhythm remained with her, a gentle pulse that seemed to match her newly steadied heartbeat. The canvas bag at her side no longer rattled with restless urgency, but carried its precious cargo with the quiet dignity of seeds that knew their time would come. 3 days into her journey, as evening shadows stretched long across a meadow dotted with wild lupine, Sarah encountered another traveler making camp beside a small creek. The woman appeared to be around 60, with silver-streaked hair braided with colourful threads, and hands that bore the particular stains that come from working with natural dyes. "Good evening," the woman called out, her voice carrying the warm invitation of someone comfortable with solitude but welcoming of company. "I'm Mira. There's plenty of space here if you'd like to share the water source." Val. Sarah gratefully accepted, setting down her pack and drawing water from the clear stream. As she prepared her simple meal, she found herself moving with the same unhurried attention that Elias had demonstrated in his garden, each action complete in itself, rather than rush towards some future goal. "You have the manner of someone who has recently learned something important," Mira observed, stirring a pot of aromatic stew over her small fire. "There's a particular quality of stillness that comes from hard-won wisdom." As they shared their meal beneath the emerging stars, Sarah found herself recounting her time in the valley, the lessons of the garden, and her growing understanding of patience as an active rather than passive practice. Mira listened with the deep attention of someone who understood the significance of such transformations. "I too have learned about the relationship between time and creation," Mira said, when Sarah had finished her story. "Though my teacher was not a garden, but something equally patient and persistent." She reached into her travel pack and withdrew a length of fabric unlike anything Sarah had ever seen. Even in the flickering firelight, the cloth seemed to hold depth and movement, colors flowing into each other like water, like sky, like the subtle gradations of light that occur just before dawn. "This is what I do," Mira explained, running her fingers along the fabric surface. "I work with natural dyes, creating colors that exist nowhere else in the world. But the process requires a kind of patience that most people cannot fathom." She held the cloth closer to the firelight, revealing intricate patterns that seemed to shift and breathe with the dancing flames. This particular piece took 3 years to complete, not because the work was difficult, but because each color required its own season, its own perfect conditions, its own time to develop and set properly. Sarah leaned forward, fascinated. 3 years for one piece of cloth? "The blue came from indigo plants that I grew for 2 seasons before they were mature enough to produce the depth of color I needed," Mira continued. "The red required gathering madder root at precisely the right time of year, then processing it through cycles of fermentation that could not be rushed. The yellow came from wildflowers that bloom for only a few weeks each summer, and the timing had to align with the moon phases for the most stable dye." She folded the fabric carefully, her movements reverent. But the colors themselves were only part of the process. The cloth had to rest between each application, sometimes for months, allowing the fibers to fully accept each hue before the next could be applied. Attempting to hurry the process would have resulted in muddy colors and weak binding. The fire crackled between them, sending sparks up toward the star-filled sky. Sarah found herself thinking of the sunflower seeds she had planted with such impatience, and how their invisible germination had required the same kind of faithful waiting that Mira described. "How did you learn to work with such extended timelines?" Sarah asked. "Didn't you ever want to see results more quickly?" Mira smiled, her weathered face reflecting years of practice in the arts of patience. "When I was young, I tried to speed everything up. I would increase the heat to make dyes process faster, or add extra mordant to intensify colors immediately. The results were always disappointing, sometimes disastrous." She poked at the fire with a stick, sending up a shower of orange embers. "I remember one particularly frustrating season when I was working on a commission for a temple, a ceremonial banner that needed to be a very specific shade of purple. I had the materials, I had the technique, but I couldn't achieve the exact color I needed." Her voice took on the quality of someone sharing a story that had shaped her understanding. "I kept adjusting the recipe, changing the timing, trying different combinations of ingredients. Every attempt produced purple, but not the purple that lived in my mind, not the color that would honor the sacred purpose of the banner." She paused, looking up at the stars that had grown brighter as the fire burned lower. "Finally, an old dyer in the next village taught me something that changed everything. She said, 'You are trying to create a color that exists in your imagination rather than discovering the color that wants to emerge from these materials in this season under these conditions.'" Sarah felt something stir in her understanding, a recognition that echoed her experience with the seeds and Elias's teaching about working with natural processes rather than against them. "What did she mean?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already understood. "She meant that true mastery isn't about imposing our will on materials or processes, but about learning to collaborate with them," Mira replied. "When I stopped trying to force my imagined purple and started paying attention to what the indigo and madder wanted to become in partnership with my particular water, my specific pot, the exact temperature of that season, something magical happened." She reached for her pack again and withdrew another piece of fabric, this one a deep purple that seemed to hold the essence of twilight itself. This is the banner I eventually created. The color that emerged wasn't exactly what I had originally envisioned, but it was more beautiful than anything I could have planned. It was the purple that belonged to that particular moment, that specific collaboration between my intention and the material's inherent nature. The two women sat in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in contemplation of how patience and partnership with natural processes had transformed their understanding of creation itself. The creek continued its gentle conversation with the stones, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called to its mate. "There's another lesson the dyes taught me," Mira continued eventually, "about the difference between waiting and watching. When I was young, waiting felt passive, empty, frustrating. But watching is entirely different. Watching is active engagement with processes we cannot control, but can deeply understand." She gestured toward the pot where she had been cooking their dinner. "Even making this simple stew required watching. Watching for the moment when the vegetables were tender but not mushy, when the herbs had released their essence but not been cooked so long they became bitter. No timer could tell me these things. Only careful, patient observation." Sarah nodded, remembering how Elias had taught her to read the subtle signs of the garden, to notice the way plants communicated their needs through changes in leaf color, growth patterns, the behavior of beneficial insects around them. "In my dye work," Mira continued, "I learned to watch for signs that most people would never notice. The way steam rises differently when a dye bath reaches the perfect temperature. The subtle shift in the water's surface tension when the mordant has fully dissolved. The particular quality of light that indicates when a color has achieved its deepest saturation." She reached into the fire with a stick, adjusting the burning logs. "These signs cannot be rushed into existence. They emerge when conditions are right, and learning to recognize them becomes a form of meditation, a practice of presence that transforms waiting from suffering into anticipation, from emptiness into fullness." As the night deepened around them, Mira shared more stories of her apprenticeship in the arts of natural dyeing. She spoke of seasons spent gathering materials, learning to recognize the perfect moment for harvesting each plant, of failed batches that taught her as much as successful ones, of the deep satisfaction that came from working in harmony with cycles and processes that connected her to generations of craftspeople who had practiced these same arts. "The most profound lesson," she said, as they prepared to settle into sleep, "came when I realized that my impatience with the process was actually impatience with myself. I wanted to be the kind of person who could create beautiful colors, but I wasn't willing to become the kind of person who could work with the deep patience such creation required." She spread her sleeping roll beside the dying fire. "When I finally accepted that mastering the craft meant allowing the craft to master me, to reshape my relationship with time and expectation, everything changed. The work became not just about creating beautiful things, but about cultivating the qualities of character that make such creation possible." Sarah lay in her own bedroll, gazing up at the vast expanse of stars overhead. The conversation had illuminated something she was still learning to articulate, an understanding that the external practice of gardening or dyeing or any craft requiring patience was inseparable from the internal practice of becoming the kind of person who could sustain such work. "What are you working on now?" she asked quietly. "A series of pieces inspired by the changing seasons," Mira replied, her voice already soft with approaching sleep. "Each one will require an entire year to complete, following the natural cycles of growth, harvest, dormancy, and renewal. I begin by planting the dye plants in spring, tend them through summer, harvest in autumn, and process the colors through winter. The cloth itself becomes a record of the year's passage. Boshiti, the image of fabric that held within its fibers the memory of an entire year's weather, growth, and seasonal change, struck Sarah as profoundly beautiful. It represented a form of creation that honored time, rather than trying to transcend it, that worked with natural rhythms rather than against them. As sleep gradually claimed her, Sarah found herself dreaming of gardens that grew in perfect synchronization, with lengths of cloth developing their colors. Both forms of creation unfolding according to ancient wisdom that could not be hurried, but could be trusted completely. The next morning, as they shared a simple breakfast beside the creek, Mira offered Sarah a small bundle wrapped in plain cloth. Inside was a length of fabric dyed the soft green of new growth, the color that appears in the first weeks of spring when life returns to the world. "This is for you," Mira said, "not as decoration but as a reminder. When you're tempted to rush a process, to force an outcome, to give up because visible progress seems too slow, touch this fabric and remember that the most beautiful colors emerge only when we learn to work in partnership with time itself." Sarah accepted the gift with deep gratitude, understanding that she was receiving more than cloth. She was receiving a tangible reminder of the wisdom that both the garden and the dye pot had taught about the relationship between patience and beauty, between time and creation. As they prepared to part ways, each continuing their own journey, Mira shared one final insight. "I've learned that every craft requiring patience eventually teaches the same fundamental truth. Whether we're growing plants, developing colors, or cultivating any skill that connects us to natural processes, we discover that we are not separate from what we're creating. We become part of the process, and the process becomes part of us." She shouldered her pack, which Sarah now understood contained not just materials for dyeing, but the patient wisdom accumulated through years of learning to work with time rather than against it. "The garden taught you to trust in invisible growth," Mira continued. "My dyes have taught me to trust in gradual transformation. But perhaps what we've both learned is that patience isn't just a technique for better results. It's a way of being in the world that honors the deep rhythms that connect all life." As Sarah watched Mira disappear down the path that led toward the river valleys, she felt the weight and warmth of the green fabric in her pack. More than a keepsake, it was a bridge between the wisdom of the garden and whatever lessons awaited her ahead. The creek continued its eternal conversation with the stones, and Sarah found herself listening with new ears, hearing in its voice the same patient persistence that had guided both the sunflower seeds through their germination and the indigo plants through their slow transformation into color. She began walking again, but her pace had changed once more. No longer the hurried rush of her arrival at Elias's garden, nor even the steadier rhythm she had discovered there. Now she moved with the measured cadence of someone who understood that the journey itself was the destination, that each step was complete in itself, while also part of a larger unfolding that would reveal its purpose in its own perfect time. The mountains ahead rose like sleeping giants against the morning sky, their peaks touched with snow that caught the early light like scattered diamonds. Sarah's path wound steadily upward through forests of pine and cedar, where the air grew thinner and more fragrant with each mile climbed. The green fabric from Mira rested secure in her pack, but it was the lessons both women had shared that occupied her thoughts as she walked. 3 days into the mountain passage, as afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the trail, Sarah came upon a sight that made her pause in wonder. Carved into the living rock of the mountainside was a temple unlike any she had ever seen, its entrance framed by pillars that seemed to grow naturally from the stone itself. The architecture appeared ancient, weathered by countless seasons, yet somehow timeless in its simple elegance. From within the temple came the sound of rhythmic tapping, metal against stone, steady as a heartbeat. Drawn by curiosity and the promise of shelter before nightfall, Sarah approached the carved doorway and called out a respectful greeting. The tapping ceased, and after a moment, an elderly man emerged from the shadows of the interior. His hair was white as the mountain snow, his hands stained with what appeared to be stone dust, and his eyes held the particular clarity that comes from years of focused practice. He moved with the measured grace of someone who had learned to work in harmony with resistant materials. "Welcome, traveler," he said, his voice carrying the resonance of someone accustomed to working in spaces where sound echoed and amplified. "I am Kale, keeper of this temple. You arrive at an auspicious time, just as the day's work concludes and evening contemplation begins." Froi. Sarah introduced herself and gratefully accepted his invitation to share the simple evening meal and shelter for the night. As they prepared food together in the temple's modest kitchen, she learned that Kyle was not just the temple's caretaker, but its creator, a stone carver who had spent the last 32 years slowly excavating and shaping this sacred space from the mountain itself. 32 years, Sarah repeated, thinking of her own recent lessons about extended timelines and patient creation. How is such a project even conceived, let alone sustained? Kyle smiled, ladling soup into wooden bowls. It begins with a single strike of chisel against stone, then another, then another. Each day, I remove a little more of what doesn't belong, revealing a little more of what was always waiting to be discovered within the rock. After their meal, he led her into the main chamber of the temple, lighting oil lamps that revealed the full scope of his decades-long endeavor. The space was breathtaking in its serene beauty. Columns rose from floor to ceiling in perfect proportion, their surfaces carved with intricate patterns that seemed to flow like water frozen in stone. The walls held niches for meditation, each one shaped with such precision that they appeared to have been formed by nature rather than human hands. But what struck Sarah most profoundly was the sense of unity that pervaded the space. Every element, from the smallest decorative detail to the sweeping curves of the ceiling, worked in harmony with every other element. The temple felt not like a structure imposed upon the mountain, but like something the mountain had always intended to become. "How did you know what shape wanted to emerge from the stone?" Sarah asked, running her fingers along a column that was as smooth as silk despite being carved from granite. Kyle settled onto a stone bench that had been carved to follow the natural contours of the human body. "In the beginning, I didn't know. I had grand plans, detailed drawings, measurements and calculations. I was going to impose my vision upon this mountain through sheer force of will and technique." He gestured toward the walls around them. "The first year was a battle. I fought the stone, trying to make it conform to my predetermined ideas. My tools broke constantly, my hands bled, my back ached from working against the natural grain of the rock. And the results were crude, clumsy, nothing like the elegant space I had imagined." The lamplight flickered across his weathered features as he continued. "I was ready to abandon the project entirely when I met an old sculptor in the village below. She looked at my rough attempts and said something that changed everything. She said, 'You're trying to force the stone to become what you think it should be, instead of discovering what it's trying to tell you it wants to become.'" Sarah felt the familiar resonance of wisdom that connected to her experiences with the garden and the dye work. What did she mean? "She taught me to listen to the stone itself," Carl replied. "To feel for the natural fracture lines, to notice where the rock was dense and where it was more yielding. To work with the existing patterns in the mineral structure rather than against them." He rose and walked to one of the carved columns, placing both hands flat against its surface. "This column, for instance, when I first began working on it, I planned to make it perfectly circular, geometrically precise. But as I carved away the outer layers, I discovered that the grain of the stone wanted to flow in a slightly different direction. Instead of fighting this tendency, I began to follow it. The result was a column that possessed a subtle spiral movement, barely perceptible, but adding a sense of life and energy to the structural element. The stone taught me that true mastery isn't about imposing perfect geometric forms, but about finding the perfect balance between human intention and the material's inherent nature. They spent the evening walking through different areas of the temple, each section revealing new aspects of Kael's evolving relationship with his chosen medium. In the early chambers, carved during his first years of work, the technique was competent, but the forms felt somewhat forced, constrained by his original rigid vision. In the later sections, the carving flowed with natural grace, as if the stone had willingly participated in its own transformation. The most important lesson came in my 5th year, Kael shared as they paused in a chamber whose walls were covered with intricate relief carvings. I was working on a particularly challenging section where the stone kept fracturing unexpectedly. No matter how carefully I planned my cuts, the rock would split in ways I hadn't anticipated. He pointed to an area where what had clearly been intended as a smooth surface had instead been carved into a complex pattern of flowing lines. I was furious at first, thinking the flaws in the stone were ruining my design. But as I stepped back and really looked at what was happening, I realized the fractures were creating something more beautiful than what I had originally planned. The cracks had guided him toward a pattern that captured the essence of flowing water, appropriate for a chamber designed for contemplation of change and impermanence. That was when I understood that resistance from the material wasn't an obstacle to overcome, but information to incorporate. The stone was teaching me about its own nature, and by learning to listen, I could create something that honored both my artistic vision and the inherent qualities of the rock itself. As the night deepened, they settled in the main chamber for evening meditation. The space seemed designed to encourage contemplation, its proportions creating a sense of both intimacy and vastness. The oil lamps cast dancing shadows on the carved walls, bringing the stone to life with movement and depth. In the early years, Kael said softly, his voice blending with the natural acoustics of the chamber, I measured progress by how much stone I removed each day. I was impatient to see dramatic changes, to carve away large sections and witness immediate transformation. His words carried the weight of hard-won understanding. But I learned that the most profound changes happen through countless small refinements. A surface that appears finished might require hundreds of tiny adjustments, each one barely visible individually but contributing to an overall perfection that can only be achieved through patient attention to detail. Sarah thought of her sunflowers, how their most crucial growth had happened invisibly below ground, and of Mira's dyes, how the final beautiful colors emerge through multiple subtle applications over extended time periods. The stone taught me that there are rhythms to creative work that cannot be forced, Kael continued. Some days, the rock would yield easily to my tools, allowing significant progress. Other days, it would resist every strike, and I learned to recognize when pushing harder would only cause damage. He described how he had developed the ability to read the stone's condition, influenced by factors like temperature, humidity, and even seasonal changes in the mountain's structure. I learned to work with the stone when it was receptive, and to step back when it needed time to settle after major excavations. The concept of allowing materials their own timeline for accepting change struck Sarah as profoundly wise. It connected to everything she was learning about patience, not as passive waiting, but as active attunement to the natural rhythms of transformation. What sustained you through the decades when the end result was still so far from completion? Sarah asked. Kael considered the question carefully before responding. I had to learn to find satisfaction in the process itself rather than postponing fulfillment until some distant moment of completion. Each day's work, no matter how small, was complete in itself while also contributing to the larger vision. He gestured toward the carved walls surrounding them. I developed the practice of ending each day by appreciating what had been accomplished, no matter how minor it might seem. The smooth finish on a few square inches of surface, the successful completion of a challenging cut, the discovery of a particularly beautiful pattern in the stone's natural grain. This daily practice of recognizing incremental progress had sustained him through periods when the overall project seemed overwhelming or impossibly distant from completion. I learned that if I could only find satisfaction in the finished temple, I would live most of my life in dissatisfaction. But if I could find joy in each day's honest work, then every day became fulfilling, regardless of how much remained to be done. As they sat in meditation, surrounded by the fruits of 3 decades of patient labor, Sarah felt herself absorbing not just the specific lessons of stone carving, but the deeper principles that seem to govern all forms of meaningful creation. Whether growing plants, developing colors, or shaping stone, the most profound results emerged through sustained partnership with natural processes rather than attempts to dominate or rush them. The oil lamps burned lower as the night progressed, their diminishing light creating an ever more intimate atmosphere in the carved chamber. Kyle's voice grew softer but more resonant as he shared the deepest insights from his decades of practice. There came a point, perhaps in my 15th year of work, when I realized I was no longer the same person who had begun this project, he said. The daily practice of patient attention, of listening to the stone, of working with resistance rather than against it, had fundamentally changed who I was. He described how the temple had become not just his creation, but his teacher, instructing him in virtues he hadn't known he needed to develop. The stone taught me humility by showing me how little I actually controlled. It taught me perseverance by requiring consistent effort, day after day, year after year. It taught me presence by demanding complete attention to each moment of work. Most profoundly, the work had taught him about the relationship between effort and surrender. I had to learn when to apply force and when to yield, when to push forward with my vision, and when to allow the stone to guide the process in unexpected directions. This balance cannot be learned intellectually. It must be felt through direct engagement with resistant materials over extended time. The parallels to Sarah's own recent learning were unmistakable. In the garden, she had discovered when to intervene and when to trust natural processes. In listening to Mira's stories about dying, she had understood how the most beautiful results emerged from collaboration between human intention and material properties. What will happen when the temple is finally complete? Sarah asked. Kyle smiled, an expression of deep contentment crossing his features. I used to think completion would bring a sense of triumph, of having conquered the mountain and achieved my vision. But now I understand that completion will simply mark the beginning of a different kind of relationship with this space. He explained how the temple would require ongoing maintenance, seasonal adjustments, careful preservation of the carved surfaces against weather and time. The work will never truly end. It will only change form. And I've come to see this not as a burden, but as a gift. The temple will continue to teach me for as long as I'm able to listen. As dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, visible through carefully placed openings in the temple's design, Kale led Sarah to a small chamber she hadn't seen the previous evening. Here, carved into the wall, was a detailed relief depicting the mountain as it had been before his work began, alongside images showing the temple's gradual emergence from the living rock. This is my record of the transformation, he explained. Not just of the stone, but of my understanding of what it means to create something that will outlast the creator. The carvings showed the project's evolution with remarkable honesty, including failed attempts, abandoned approaches, and the gradual refinement of technique that had led to the temple's current beauty. I wanted future visitors to understand that mastery isn't about avoiding mistakes, but about learning from them, incorporating them into an ever-deepening understanding of the work. As Sarah prepared to continue her journey, Kale presented her with a small stone, perfectly smooth and warm to the touch. This came from the very first chamber I carved, he said. It represents all the material that had to be removed to reveal what was waiting within. Keep it as a reminder that creation often requires us to chip away what doesn't belong in order to discover what does. The stone felt surprisingly alive in her palm, carrying the weight of decades of patient labor and the warmth of human hands that had shaped it with love and dedication. Like Mira's green fabric, it was more than a keepsake. It was a tangible connection to the wisdom of sustained practice, of finding meaning in daily work toward distant goals. "Remember," Kyle said as she shouldered her pack, "that every project requiring extended patience teaches the same fundamental truth." We begin thinking we are creating something external to ourselves, but we discover that the deepest transformation occurs within us. The garden changes the gardener, the dyes change the dyer, the stone changes the carver. As Sarah descended from the temple, following a path that wound down through forests toward valleys she had never seen, she carried with her 3 tangible reminders of the lessons learned from patient practitioners. The smooth stone from Kyle's temple, the green fabric from Mira's dyes, and the seeds from Elias's garden that continued to rest in her pack, waiting for the right conditions to sprout. But more than these physical objects, she carried a transformed understanding of time itself and her relationship to the processes of growth and creation that surrounded her. The hurried urgency that had once driven her steps had been replaced by something steadier and more sustainable, a rhythm that honored both the destination and the journey, both the vision and the daily work required to manifest it. The path ahead wound through unknown territories, but Sarah no longer felt anxious about what she might encounter. She had learned to trust in the patient unfolding of experience, to find satisfaction in each day's honest engagement with whatever challenges or opportunities presented themselves, and to recognize that the most profound transformations often happen so gradually that they're invisible until we look back and marvel at how far we've traveled. The morning sun climbed higher, warming her back as she walked, and somewhere ahead, new teachers and new lessons waited to continue her education in the ancient arts of patience, presence, and the quiet courage required to plant seeds in ground we may never see fully flourish. The valley below spread before Sarah like an unfinished painting, its colors muted by morning mist that clung to the hollows between rolling hills. Her descent from the mountain temple had taken most of the day, and now, as evening approached, she found herself in a landscape entirely different from anything she had encountered before. Here, the terrain was gentler, marked by terraced fields that climbed the hillsides in elegant steps. Stone walls, weathered smooth by centuries of rain and wind, divided the land into precise geometric patterns that somehow felt completely natural. In the distance, she could see the warm glow of lights from what appeared to be a small village nestled beside a meandering river. As darkness settled over the valley, Sarah made her way toward the lights, hoping to find lodging for the night. The path she followed was paved with flat stones, worn smooth by countless feet but carefully maintained. Every few hundred yards, she passed small shrines built into the stone walls, each one containing a simple oil lamp that cast a gentle circle of light along the way. The village, when she reached it, proved to be unlike any settlement she had previously encountered. The buildings were constructed from the same weathered stone as the field walls, their roofs covered with clay tiles that gleamed softly in the lamplight. But what struck her most immediately was the quality of silence that pervaded the streets. This was not the empty quiet of an abandoned place, but rather the peaceful hush of a community that had learned to move through life without unnecessary noise. Doors opened and closed with barely a whisper. Footsteps on the stone streets were soft and measured. Even conversations, when she could hear them, were conducted in voices that seemed to honor the tranquility of the evening air. Following the sound of gently flowing water, Sarah made her way to what appeared to be the village center, where a fountain carved from dark stone sent streams of clear water cascading into a circular pool. The fountain was surrounded by stone benches, and seated on one of them was an elderly woman whose presence seemed to anchor the peaceful atmosphere of the entire village. The woman looked up as Sarah approached, her eyes reflecting the lamplight with a warmth that immediately put the weary traveler at ease. "Good evening, wanderer," she said, her voice carrying the particular quality of someone who chooses words carefully and speaks them with intention. "I am Naya, and you are welcome in our village." The evening is mild, the fountain sings its ancient songs, and there is always room for one more listener. Sarah gratefully accepted the invitation to sit, setting down her pack and drawing water from the fountain to refresh herself after the long descent. As she settled onto the smooth stone bench, she noticed that the fountain's design was extraordinarily intricate, with carved patterns that seemed to guide the water's flow in ways that created different musical notes as it cascaded from level to level. "The fountain is beautiful," Sarah observed, listening to the complex harmonies created by the flowing water. "It sounds almost like music." Naya smiled, running her fingers along the carved edge of the pool. "It is music in its way." The patterns were carved by my great-grandmother, who spent 43 years learning to shape stone so that water would sing as it flows. Each curve, each depression, each raised surface was placed with perfect precision to create the harmonies you hear. The concept of stone, shaped specifically to create music from flowing water, fascinated Sarah. How does someone even begin to understand such a thing? The same way anyone learns any art that requires deep patience, Naya replied, through countless small experiments, careful observation, and the willingness to let failure teach as much as success. My great-grandmother began with simple bowls, studying how water sounds different when it falls into containers of various shapes and depths. As they talked, other villagers began to gather around the fountain, drawn not by any announced meeting, but by the natural rhythm of community life that brought people together at day's end. They arrived quietly, settling onto benches or finding comfortable spots on the fountain's wide rim, each person adding to the group's peaceful energy without disrupting it. "This is our evening tradition," Naya explained softly. "We gather here as darkness falls, not to discuss the day's business or plan tomorrow's work, but simply to be present together in this moment of transition between day and night." Sarah looked around at the assembled group, noting faces of all ages, from small children who leaned against their parents to elderly individuals whose weathered features spoke of decades lived in harmony with this place and its rhythms. What struck her was the quality of attention each person brought to the gathering, a presence that felt both relaxed and alert. "We call this practice the evening listening," Naya continued. "It began generations ago, when our ancestors recognized that the end of each day offers a particular opportunity for reflection and connection that shouldn't be hurried past in preparation for tomorrow's activities." One of the younger villagers, a man perhaps 30 years old with the calloused hands of a craftsperson, spoke quietly from his position near the fountain. "Would you like to hear how the evening listening began? The story has been passed down through our families for over 200 years. Sarah nodded, drawn by the gentle ceremony of the gathering and curious about the traditions that had shaped this remarkably peaceful community. "Long ago," the man began, his voice pitched to blend with the fountain's musical tones, "this valley was home to people much like those in other places. They worked hard during the day, worried about their crops and their families, argued over boundaries and business dealings, and fell into bed each night exhausted by the effort of living." He paused, allowing the image to settle in the listeners' minds. But there was one woman in the village, a weaver named Thessa, who noticed something that others seemed to miss. She observed that the most beautiful moments of each day occurred during the brief transition between day and night, when the light was changing and the world seemed to pause between one state and another. The fountain's music seemed to grow more complex as the story continued, as if the water itself was responding to the telling. Thessa began the habit of stopping her work each evening to step outside and simply observe this daily transformation. She watched the way light moved across the valley, listened to how sounds changed as day creatures gave way to night creatures, felt how the air itself seemed to shift and settle. Other villagers began to add their voices to the story, each person contributing details that had been preserved through generations of telling. After several months of this solitary practice, Thessa realized she was experiencing a kind of peace she had never known before. The worries that had once kept her awake at night seemed less urgent. The irritations that had once disrupted her days seemed smaller and more manageable. An elderly man whose voice carried the resonance of someone who had spent decades listening to such stories added, "She began to speak with her neighbors about what she was discovering. Not preaching or trying to convince them, but simply sharing her observations about how these moments of intentional attention seemed to change her experience of life itself. One by one," Naya continued, other villagers began to join Thessa in her evening observations. At first, each person practiced alone, but gradually they found themselves gathering in the same places, drawn together by the shared recognition of these daily moments of transition. The group around the fountain had grown as the story progressed, with more villagers arriving silently and settling into the circle. Sarah noticed that children listened with the same attention as adults, and that the story seemed to belong equally to all present, rather than being performed by a single storyteller. The practice evolved naturally over time, another voice added. What began as individual moments of observation became a community practice of shared presence. The villagers discovered that their individual peace was deepened when experienced in the company of others who understood its value. But the most important discovery, Naya said, her voice taking on the weight of central truth, was that this daily practice of intentional presence began to change how people lived throughout their entire day. When you begin and end each day with deliberate attention to the present moment, that awareness starts to color all the hours in between. The fountain's music seemed to punctuate her words, its complex harmonies creating a perfect soundtrack for the story's conclusion. Disputes that had once escalated into lasting feuds were resolved more easily when both parties approached them with the clarity that comes from daily practice in presence. Work that had once felt burdensome became more satisfying when performed with the attention that this evening practice cultivated. As the story ended, the group settled into a comfortable silence, each person apparently content to simply sit with the fountain's music and the gentle presence of community. Sarah found herself relaxing more deeply than she had in months, not because anything dramatic had occurred, but because the quality of attention surrounding her was unlike anything she had previously experienced. "This is the heart of our evening listening," Naya said after a time, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not the telling of stories, though stories are often shared, but the cultivation of presence that allows us to fully receive whatever each evening offers." The practice continued without formal structure or announced activities. Sometimes individuals would share brief observations about the day, moments of beauty they had noticed, or insights that had emerged from their work. Other times, the group would sit in extended silence, each person apparently engaged in their own form of contemplation, while remaining connected to the collective awareness. Sarah found herself thinking about the various teachers she had encountered on her journey, each one demonstrating a different aspect of patient practice. Elias had taught her about trusting invisible processes of growth. Mira had shown her how gradual transformation could create extraordinary beauty. Kale had demonstrated the power of sustained daily work toward distant goals. Now, this community was teaching her about the importance of regular practices that cultivate presence and awareness. "What happens when someone misses the evening listening?" she asked quietly during one of the periods of silence. "Are there expectations or obligations?" "There are no rules," replied a young woman whose infant slept peacefully in her arms. "Some nights, work or weather keeps people away. Sometimes, individuals go through periods when they need solitude rather than community. The practice remains available without becoming a burden." An older man added, "We've learned that forced participation defeats the purpose. The evening listening works because people come when they're drawn to it, when they recognize their need for this kind of presence and connection." This approach resonated with everything Sarah had been learning about sustainable practices. like the gardening that couldn't be rushed, the dyeing that required perfect timing, and the stone carving that demanded attention to natural rhythms. The evening listening seemed to work precisely because it honored, rather than forced, human nature. As the night deepened, some villagers began to disperse, making their quiet farewells and disappearing into the lamplit streets. Others remained, apparently content to extend their evening contemplation. Children who had grown sleepy were carried home by parents who moved with the same unhurried grace that characterized all activity in this place. "Would you like to stay with us for a while?" Naya asked as the group began to thin. "There's a guest house where travelers are always welcome, and tomorrow you could see how our daily rhythms complement the evening practice you've witnessed tonight." Sarah accepted gratefully, curious to experience more of this community's approach to living with intentional presence. As Naya led her through streets that remained peaceful even as night settled fully over the valley, she reflected on how this village seemed to embody the integration of all the lessons she had been learning. The guest house proved to be as thoughtfully designed as everything else in the village, with a small room that contained exactly what was needed for comfortable rest, while avoiding any sense of excess or distraction. The bed was simple, but perfectly proportioned. A single window looked out over the terraced fields that climbed the hillsides. A small table held a basin for washing, and an oil lamp that cast warm light across walls built from the same weathered stone as the rest of the village. As she prepared for sleep, Sarah found herself listening to the subtle sounds of the village settling into night. Distant voices speaking softly, the gentle closing of doors and windows, the ever-present music of the fountain that seemed to provide a peaceful soundtrack for dreams. But most notably, she heard the quality of silence that came from a community that had learned to live without unnecessary noise, without the constant urgency that characterized so many other places. Before extinguishing her lamp, she held the smooth stone Kale had given her, feeling its weight and warmth in her palm. Tomorrow would bring new experiences, new lessons about living with presence and intention. But tonight, surrounded by the peaceful energy of this village and its evening listening practice, she felt herself settling into sleep with a depth of relaxation she hadn't known was possible. The morning came gently, announced not by jarring sounds but by the gradual increase of natural light and the soft beginning of daily activities. From her window, Sarah could see villagers beginning their work in the terraced fields, their movements measured and purposeful rather than hurried. After washing and dressing, she made her way back to the fountain, where she found Naya sitting quietly with a cup of steaming tea, apparently engaged in her own form of morning practice. The older woman looked up with a smile that suggested she had been expecting Sarah's arrival. "Good morning," Naya said, gesturing to a second cup that sat waiting on the fountain's rim. "I thought you might enjoy seeing how we begin our days here. The morning has its own particular gifts, different from but complementary to what the evening offers." Sarah accepted the tea gratefully, noting how its warmth seemed to perfectly match the cool morning air and create an ideal balance of comfort and alertness. "Do you gather in the mornings as well?" "Not in the same way," Naya replied, watching as other early risers began to appear in the village square. "The morning practice is more individual, though it often happens in the presence of others. We've learned that the day's first hours are best used for setting intentions and cultivating the awareness that will guide us through whatever work awaits." As they sat together, Sarah observed how different villagers approached the beginning of their day. Some, like Naya, sat quietly with tea or simple food, apparently engaged in contemplation. Others moved slowly through what appeared to be gentle physical exercises, stretching and breathing in ways that seemed designed to awaken the body gradually rather than shock it into activity. "The evening practice teaches us to receive," Naya explained, noting Sarah's interest in these morning rituals. "The morning practice teaches us to give, not in the sense of self-sacrifice, but in learning to offer our best attention and energy to whatever work we've chosen to do." A woman perhaps 50 years old approached the fountain, nodding respectfully to both Naya and Sarah before kneeling beside the pool to fill a large ceramic jug with water. Her movements were so graceful and deliberate that the simple act of drawing water seemed transformed into something approaching ceremony. "That's Dara," Naya said softly. "She's a potter who creates vessels that are used throughout the valley. She comes to the fountain each morning, not just to collect water for her work, but to begin her day with appreciation for the element that makes her craft possible." Sira watched as Dara completed her morning ritual, taking a moment to listen to the fountain's music before lifting the filled jug and carrying it away toward what was presumably her workshop. The woman's entire demeanor suggested someone who had found deep satisfaction in work that connected her to natural materials and community needs. "How did the village develop this way of living?" Sarah asked. "It seems so different from the hurried pace I've encountered in other places." Naya considered the question while watching the gradual increase of activity around the square. "I think it happened naturally over generations, as people recognized what truly contributed to their well-being and what merely distracted from it. When you practice paying attention to the present moment every evening, you begin to notice which daily activities bring genuine satisfaction and which are simply habits that serve no real purpose." She gestured toward the terraced fields where workers were now visible among the growing plants. "Our ancestors discovered that when work is performed with full attention, when it connects you to natural processes and community needs, it becomes a source of fulfillment rather than something to be endured until evening rest. But surely there must be conflicts, disagreements, problems that can't be resolved through contemplative practices," Sarah observed. "Of course," Naya agreed. "But we found that most conflicts arise from misunderstanding, from people acting out of their immediate emotions rather than their deeper wisdom. When individuals regularly practice cultivating presence and clarity, they're more likely to approach disagreements with curiosity rather than defensiveness." As the morning progressed, Sarah had the opportunity to observe this principle in action. She watched as two farmers discussed the maintenance of a shared irrigation channel, their conversation marked by careful listening and genuine consideration of each other's concerns. What might have become an argument in other contexts remained a collaborative problem-solving session. The evening listening teaches people to recognize the difference between their immediate reactions and their deeper understanding, Naya explained. When you've spent months or years practicing this kind of awareness, you're less likely to speak or act from temporary emotions that you might later regret. The village's approach to education particularly impressed Sarah. Children were included in both morning and evening practices according to their own natural rhythms, rather than forced participation. She observed young people learning various crafts through patient apprenticeship, with masters who seemed to understand that skills requiring years to develop couldn't be rushed. "We don't separate learning from living," explained a middle-aged man who introduced himself as the village's primary teacher. "Children learn by participating in the real work of the community, guided by adults who remember what it's like to be a beginner and who understand that mastery comes through patient practice rather than forced instruction." Sarah spent several days in the village, participating in both the evening gatherings and the quieter morning practices. She helped with various tasks, from tending the terraced gardens to assisting in workshops where craftspeople created the tools and goods needed for community life. What struck her most profoundly was how the village's approach to time seemed to create more hours in each day rather than fewer, because activities were performed with full attention rather than rushed through in anticipation of what came next. Each task became satisfying in itself rather than merely a means to some future goal. "When you're fully present with whatever you're doing," observed a baker whose bread filled the village with wonderful aromas each morning, "time expands instead of contracting. An hour spent kneading dough with complete attention feels richer and more fulfilling than a day spent rushing through tasks while thinking about something else." This observation connected to everything Sarah had learned from her various teachers about the relationship between patience and satisfaction. Whether growing plants, creating dyes, carving stone, or simply living daily life, the quality of attention brought to any activity seemed to determine both its results and its capacity to nourish the person performing it. On her final evening in the village, as she sat once again around the fountain, listening to its musical waters, Sarah reflected on how her understanding of time and presence had evolved throughout her journey. She had begun as someone frantically seeking immediate results, impatient with any process that couldn't be rushed. Now she found herself appreciating the subtle gifts that emerged only through patient attention to present moments. "What will you take with you from our village?" Naya asked as the evening listening concluded and other villagers began their quiet departures. "The understanding that presence is a practice," Sarah replied, "and that this practice can transform not just individual moments, but entire ways of living. You've shown me how a community can organize itself around values of attention and awareness rather than speed and accumulation." Naya nodded approvingly. "Remember that you don't need to live in a special place or follow particular traditions to cultivate presence. The practice can be adapted to any circumstances, any lifestyle. What matters is the regular commitment to moments of intentional awareness, whether morning or evening or any time that works for your situation." As Sarah prepared to leave the village the next morning, she carried with her not just the tangible reminders from previous teachers, but a new understanding of how contemplative practices could be woven into the fabric of daily life. The villagers had demonstrated that presence wasn't something to be achieved through special techniques, but something to be cultivated through consistent attention to whatever activities filled ordinary days. The path leading out of the valley rose gradually through landscapes that grew wilder with each mile traveled. Behind her, the terraced fields and peaceful village grew smaller in the distance, but the lessons learned there remained vivid in her awareness. She found herself walking with the same measured pace that had characterized movement throughout the village, not hurried towards some distant destination, but fully engaged with each step of the journey itself. The practices of patient attention that had begun in Elias's garden continued to deepen with each encounter, each teacher adding new dimensions to her understanding of how presence and awareness could transform not just individual projects, but entire approaches to living. The seeds in her pack had become more than potential plants. They had become symbols of all the invisible processes of growth and transformation that surrounded her at every moment. As the morning sun climbed higher and the path led toward unknown territories, Sarah carried with her the accumulated wisdom of gardeners and dyers, stone carvers, and contempla aspects of the patient artisatives, each one demonstrating different that could transform hurried seeking into peaceful presence, anxious striving into sustainable practice, and isolated effort into connection with the larger rhythms that governed all life. The mountain path wound through ancient forests where shafts of sunlight created cathedral-like spaces between towering pines. Sarah walked steadily upward, her breathing deep and measured, no longer fighting the terrain, but moving in harmony with its natural rhythm. The lessons from the valley village had settled into her bones, becoming less conscious techniques, and more simply her natural way of being. 3 days into the ascent, as afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the trail, she encountered something that made her pause in wonder. Carved into a massive boulder beside the path was a symbol she didn't recognize, its lines flowing with such grace that it seemed to have grown naturally from the stone itself. The carving was weathered by countless seasons, yet somehow timeless in its simple elegance. Following her intuition, Sarah left the main path and discovered a narrow trail that led deeper into the forest, marked at intervals by similar symbols carved into trees and stones. The deeper she ventured, the more the forest seemed to change around her, taking on qualities of profound stillness that reminded her of the most peaceful moments in the village square. After walking for perhaps an hour along this hidden path, she emerged into a circular clearing where 7 ancient oaks formed a perfect ring around a small spring. The water bubbled up from deep within the earth, creating a pool so clear she could see every grain of sand on its bottom. Beside the spring sat an elderly woman whose presence seemed as natural and enduring as the great trees themselves. The woman looked up as Sarah approached, her eyes reflecting the same deep clarity as the spring water. She wore simple robes that might have been any color once, but had faded to the soft grey-brown of weathered bark. Her hair was white as morning mist, braided with small stones and dried flowers that spoke of someone who lived in intimate connection with the natural world. "Welcome, traveler," the woman said, her voice carrying the texture of wind through leaves. "I am Lydia, keeper of this sacred grove. You arrive at the time when day begins its conversation with night, when the veil between visible and invisible grows thin." Sarah bowed respectfully, immediately sensing that she had encountered someone whose understanding ran deeper than any of her previous teachers. "I am Sarah, and I'm grateful for this unexpected sanctuary. I was following the mountain path when I noticed the symbols that led me here." Lydia smiled, gesturing toward the carved marks visible on several of the great oaks. "Those symbols have guided seekers to this place for over 800 years. They mark not just a physical location, but a threshold between ordinary awareness and something more profound." As evening settled over the grove, Lydia invited Sarah to share a simple meal beside the spring. The food was basic, wild herbs and root vegetables, but prepared and served with such mindful attention that each bite seemed to carry the essence of the forest itself. "This grove," Lydia explained as they ate, "has been a place of learning for countless generations. Not learning in the sense of accumulating information, but learning to perceive reality with greater depth and clarity. The teachers here have discovered something remarkable about the nature of awareness itself." She gestured toward the circle of ancient oaks. "These trees have stood here for over 1,000 years, witnesses to the changing seasons, the rise and fall of civilizations, the endless cycles of birth and death that govern all existence. Yet they remain rooted, present, responding to each moment's conditions while maintaining their essential nature." As darkness deepened around them, Lydia lit a small oil lamp that cast dancing shadows on the massive tree trunks. The spring continued its gentle bubbling, creating a soothing soundtrack that seemed to invite deeper levels of relaxation and attention. "The fundamental teaching of this place," Lydia continued, her voice taking on the quality of someone sharing ancient wisdom, "concerns the difference between the awareness that seeks and the awareness that simply is. Most people spend their lives in seeking awareness, always reaching towards something they believe will complete them, fulfill them, make them finally happy." Sarah felt a familiar stirring of recognition. This description matched her own life before encountering the garden, when she had moved from one pursuit to another in search of lasting satisfaction. "But there exists another kind of awareness," Lydia continued. "One that doesn't seek because it lacks nothing, doesn't grasp because it already contains everything necessary for peace. This awareness doesn't need to be achieved or developed. It simply needs to be recognized as what we already are beneath all our seeking and striving." The concept was both simple and profound, challenging everything Sarah thought she understood about spiritual development and personal growth. But surely, we need to work on ourselves, to improve and grow and learn new things. "There's a difference," Lydia replied gently, "between natural growth and compulsive seeking. A tree grows toward the light not because it's dissatisfied with its current state, but because growth toward light is its nature. When we align with our true nature, development happens naturally, without the strain and dissatisfaction that characterizes most human effort." As they sat in the lamplight beside the ancient spring, Lydia began to share the story of how she had discovered this grove and the teachings it contained. Her words painted pictures of a young woman, much like Sarah, driven by restless seeking, moving from teacher to teacher and practice to practice in search of something she couldn't quite name. "I had studied with meditation masters and contemplative communities, learned dozens of techniques for calming the mind and opening the heart," Lydia recalled. "Each practice brought temporary relief, moments of peace and clarity, but always the seeking resumed. There was always another level to achieve, another realization to attain, another way to improve myself. She described how exhaustion with this endless pursuit had eventually led her to this grove, where she had intended to rest for only a night before continuing her spiritual quest. But something about this place stopped me in my tracks. Not the beauty of the setting, though it is beautiful, but a quality of presence that seemed to emanate from the trees, the spring, the very earth itself. The ancient oaks had become her first teachers, demonstrating through their simple existence the kind of awareness she had been seeking through complex practices. They showed me that presence doesn't need to be cultivated because it's already here. Peace doesn't need to be achieved because it's what remains when we stop disturbing it with our constant mental activity. Over the following days, as Sarah remained in the grove to learn from both Lydia and the profound silence of the ancient trees, she began to understand what her teacher meant. The practices she had learned from previous teachers, while valuable, had all been based on the assumption that her current state was somehow insufficient, that she needed to become different than what she was. "Watch the spring," Lydia suggested one morning as they sat in meditation beside the clear water. "Notice how it doesn't try to be deeper or clearer or more beautiful. It simply expresses its nature as water emerging from the earth. This is the awareness we're pointing toward, the natural state that exists before we complicate it with ideas about improvement." The grove seemed designed to support this recognition. The ancient trees created a space of such profound stillness that the usual chatter of mental activity gradually quieted on its own. The spring's gentle sounds provided a focus point that didn't require effort to maintain. The circular arrangement of the great oaks created a sense of completion, of being exactly where one needed to be. "This is why the grove has been preserved as a teaching place for so many centuries," Lydia explained. "Not because anything special happens here, but because the natural environment supports the recognition of what's already present. The trees, the spring, the very arrangement of elements creates conditions where our essential nature can be perceived without obstruction." Sarah found herself spending hours simply sitting with individual trees, learning to perceive their presence not as objects in her environment, but as expressions of the same awareness that looked through her own eyes. The practice required no special techniques, no complicated instructions, simply the willingness to rest attention in direct experience rather than thoughts about experience. "The teachings of this place can't be put into words," Lydia acknowledged as they walked together through the grove one afternoon. "Words point toward the recognition, create conditions that might support it, but the actual seeing must happen directly. No one can show you your own awareness. They can only suggest that you look." This pointing towards direct recognition, rather than gradual development, represented a fundamental shift from everything Sarah had learned before. Instead of practices designed to change her state, she was being invited to notice what was already present. Instead of working toward future attainment, she was learning to rest in immediate awareness. The grove's influence extended beyond formal teaching periods into every aspect of daily life. Gathering water from the spring, preparing simple meals, tending the small fire that provided warmth during cool evenings, all became opportunities to practice this kind of natural presence that didn't depend on special states or particular conditions. "Notice," Lydia observed as they prepared their evening meal, "how awareness remains constant even as its contents change. The awareness that perceives the sound of crackling fire is the same awareness that perceives the taste of food, the feeling of warmth, the sight of stars appearing overhead. This unchanging awareness is what we're pointing toward." The teaching was both utterly simple and completely revolutionary. Instead of seeking to improve or transform her awareness, Sarah was learning to recognize awareness as the unchanging background against which all experience appeared and disappeared. The seeking that had driven her for so long began to feel less urgent, replaced by a growing sense of coming home to something she had never actually left. The paradox of this teaching, Lydia explained one morning, as they sat watching sunrise light filter through the ancient branches, is that you can't grasp it with the same mind that seeks everything else. The very effort to understand or achieve this recognition becomes an obstacle to it. She gestured toward the spring, whose surface reflected the morning light in constantly shifting patterns. The water doesn't try to reflect the sky. Reflection is simply what happens when water is still and clear. Similarly, when the mind settles into its natural stillness, the recognition of our true nature happens by itself. This approach required a fundamental shift in how Sarah related to her own experience. Instead of analyzing or trying to improve her mental states, she learned to rest as the awareness within which all states appeared. Instead of seeking special experiences, she discovered the extraordinary nature of ordinary awareness itself. The grove doesn't give you anything you don't already have, Lydia clarified, as Sarah prepared to continue her journey after a week of profound learning. It simply provides conditions where what you are can be recognized without the usual distractions and complications. As Sarah packed her few belongings, she realized that something fundamental had shifted in her relationship to the journey itself. The restless seeking that had originally set her on this path had been replaced by a quiet confidence in her own essential nature, a trust that didn't depend on external circumstances or achievements. "Remember," Lydia said as they stood together beneath the great oaks for their final conversation, "that what you've recognized here travels with you everywhere. The grove is ultimately not a place, but a quality of awareness that can be accessed regardless of external conditions." She placed her hand on the bark of the nearest ancient oak. These trees root the recognition in this particular location, but the awareness they point toward is not limited by location. It's what you are, wherever you go, whatever circumstances you encounter. As Sarah prepared to leave the grove, following the same hidden path that had brought her to this threshold between worlds, she carried with her not just the lessons of patient practice learned from previous teachers, but a revolutionary understanding of the very nature of seeking itself. The symbols carved into trees and stones that marked her way back to the main trail now seemed to point not toward external destinations, but toward the recognition of what she already was. The journey continued, but its fundamental purpose had transformed from seeking something missing to expressing something eternally present. The mountain path stretched ahead, winding through landscapes she had never seen. But Sarah no longer walked as someone hoping to find what she lacked. She moved as an expression of the same awareness that looked through the eyes of ancient trees, that bubbled up from deep springs, that remained constant and present regardless of what appeared within it. The canvas bag still contained seeds from the garden, fabric from the dyer, stone from the temple carver, but these had become more than reminders of lessons learned. They were expressions of the same creative awareness that manifested as everything she encountered, including the one who encountered it. As the grove disappeared behind her and new territories opened ahead, Sarah understood that every step of her journey had been leading not toward some distant goal, but toward the recognition of what had been present all along, closer than her own breath, more intimate than her own thoughts, more essential than her own seeking. The practices of patience she had learned remained valuable, not as methods for achieving something, but as expressions of the natural rhythm that governed all manifestation. The garden seasons, the dyer's gradual transformations, the stone carver's decades of dedicated work, the village's contemplative rhythms, all reflected the same timeless awareness that she was learning to recognize as her own most intimate nature. The path wound onward through ancient forests where every tree stood as a teacher. Every stream sang the same wordless instruction. Every moment offered the opportunity for recognition that could transform seeking into being, effort into effortless presence, the long journey toward home into the discovery that she had never left. the ancient forest path began its gentle descent toward valleys Sarah had never imagined, each turn revealing landscapes that seemed painted by an artist who understood the secret language of light and shadow. The recognition she had gained in the sacred grove traveled with her like a faithful companion, transforming her perception of everything she encountered. Where once she might have hurried past a cluster of wildflowers to reach some imagined destination, now she found herself naturally pausing to witness their perfect expression of beauty that asked nothing in return. Where once the sound of wind through pine needles might have gone unnoticed beneath the chatter of mental planning, now it arrived as pure music that needed no interpretation or improvement. The path itself seemed different, not just a route between places, but a continuous teaching about presence and movement, about how one could travel without leaving the eternal now that was always available regardless of location. Each stone beneath her feet, each shaft of sunlight through the canopy, each distant bird call became an invitation to recognize the awareness within which all experience appeared and dissolved. As evening approached, on her third day of descent, Sarah found herself at the edge of a vast meadow where thousands of fireflies were beginning their nightly dance. The sight stopped her completely, not because she needed to analyze or remember it, but because something in her recognized itself in their effortless illumination. She made camp at the meadow's edge, building a small fire and preparing her simple meal while surrounded by the gentle symphony of emerging night sounds. As darkness deepened, the fireflies' display intensified, creating patterns of light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with her own heartbeat. Sitting beside her fire, watching the meadow transform into a galaxy of living stars, Sarah felt the last vestiges of her old seeking nature dissolve completely. There was nowhere else to go, nothing else to achieve, no further recognition needed. The journey would continue because movement was natural to her body, but the desperate searching that had once driven her steps had been replaced by something infinitely more sustainable. A sound from the forest behind her drew her attention, and she turned to see an elderly man emerging from between the trees. He moved with the careful grace of someone whose body had grown fragile with age, but his eyes held the same clear presence she had learned to recognize in all her teachers. "Good evening, young traveler," he said, his voice carrying the warmth of someone who had long ago made peace with both solitude and company. "I am Theron, and I live in a small cabin not far from here. The light of your fire called to me through the trees, and I thought you might welcome the company of another who appreciates the Firefly's annual celebration." Sarah invited him to share her fire and her simple food, discovering in their conversation that Theron was a storyteller who had spent decades collecting tales from travelers who passed through this remote region. But unlike other collectors of stories, he had developed an unusual relationship with the narratives he gathered. "Most people think of stories as things that happened in the past," Theron explained as they watched the fireflies dance above the meadow grass. "But I've discovered that the deepest stories are always happening now, always being lived by whoever hears them with full attention." He settled more comfortably beside the fire, his weathered hands folded in his lap. "Would you like to hear a story that's happening right now, as we sit here surrounded by these miraculous lights?" Sarah nodded, drawn by something in his manner that suggested this would be unlike any storytelling she had previously experienced. "Once upon a time, which is to say right now, in this very moment," Theron began, his voice taking on a quality that seemed to make the firefly's light dance more brightly. "There was a meadow where countless beings of light gathered each summer evening to perform a ceremony older than human memory." His words seemed to weave themselves into the actual scene surrounding them, transforming their immediate experience into something that felt both utterly ordinary and completely magical. These beings of light had learned the secret that all illumination comes not from trying to be bright, but from simply expressing the radiance that is their essential nature. They didn't compete with each other or worry about whether their light was sufficient. They simply pulsed with the rhythm that connected them to all other light in the universe. Sarah found herself listening, not just to the words, but to the way they seemed to emerge from the same silence that held the firefly's dance, the crackling fire, and her own breathing. The story wasn't separate from the moment, but was somehow the moment itself, speaking through Theron's voice. There was once a traveler, he continued, who had spent many years seeking the secret of this natural illumination. She had studied with gardeners who taught her patience, with artisans who showed her the beauty of gradual transformation, with contemplatives who revealed the peace that comes from presence. The story seemed to be telling itself through circumstances that included Sarah's own journey, yet without making direct reference to her specific experiences. Instead, it spoke to something universal in the human experience of seeking and finding, of traveling toward what we already are. This traveler discovered that each teacher had been showing her a different aspect of the same fundamental truth, that awareness itself is the light she had been seeking, and that this light doesn't need to be kindled because it is what sees, what knows, what is present in every moment of experience. As Theron spoke, the boundary between storyteller and story, between listener and tale, began to dissolve. Sarah found herself not just hearing about a traveler, but recognizing herself as the eternal traveler that exists in every human heart, the one who journeys not towards some distant destination, but into deeper recognition of what is always already here. The fireflies reminded her that illumination is not something to be achieved, but something to be expressed, not a state to be reached, but the very nature of the awareness that reaches toward everything while remaining forever at rest in itself. The story continued without conventional plot or character development, instead weaving together images and insights that seemed to arise spontaneously from the shared presence of storyteller, listener, and the living darkness alive with dancing lights. She realized that every step of her journey had been perfect, not because it had led her to some final attainment, but because each step had been taken by the same awareness that now recognized itself in the firefly's effortless radiance, in the fire's steady warmth, in the vast sky that held all phenomena while being touched by none. As the night deepened and the firefly's dance reached its peak intensity, Theron's story began to include the very moment they were sharing, speaking of travelers who met beside meadow fires to remember together what they had never really forgotten, who shared stories that were always happening in the eternal now. The greatest stories, he concluded as the fireflies gradually dimmed toward dawn, are not tales of past adventures, but recognitions of what is eternally present. Not accounts of someone else's journey, but invitations to see our own experience with fresh eyes. As morning light began to silver the meadow grass, Theron prepared to return to his forest cabin. But before departing, he shared with Sarah a practice he had developed through decades of storytelling. Instead of collecting experiences as memories to be stored away, he suggested, try receiving each moment as a story being told by life itself, with you as both the author and the audience, the seeker and the sought, the one who travels and the destination toward which all journeys point. This approach to experience as living story, rather than accumulated memory, offered Sarah yet another way to remain present with whatever unfolded, whether dramatic adventures or quiet moments of simple being. Each encounter could be received as a tale being told by the same awareness that looked through her eyes, each challenge as a plot development in the eternal story of consciousness, knowing itself. As she continued her descent toward valleys that sparkled in the morning light, Sarah carried with her not just the wisdom of individual teachers, but an understanding of how all teachings pointed toward the same fundamental recognition. The garden's patience, the dyer's gradual transformation, the stone carver's dedication, the village's contemplative rhythms, the grove's timeless presence, and now the storyteller's living narratives all revealed different faces of the same essential truth. The canvas bag still held its collection of tangible reminders, but these had become doorways rather than possessions, each one capable of opening into the recognition that awareness itself was the treasure she had been seeking. the home toward which all journeys led, the light that needed no fuel because it was the very nature of seeing itself. The path ahead wound through landscapes she had never seen, toward encounters she could not imagine, but Sarah no longer walked as someone seeking completion through future experience. She moved as the eternal awareness that was already complete, already whole, already home, expressing itself through the beautiful play of seeking and finding that gave life its endless capacity for surprise and recognition. The morning sun climbed higher, warming her back as she walked, and somewhere in the distance, new teachers and new forms of the same eternal teaching waited to continue her education in the art of being what she had never stopped being, recognizing what had never been hidden, and coming home to what she had never left. The descent continued through forests that gradually gave way to rolling hills, dotted with ancient stone circles and standing monuments that spoke of civilizations that had long ago returned to Earth. Each weathered marker seemed to whisper the same message the grove's ancient trees had shared, that awareness outlasts all its temporary forms while remaining intimately present in each manifestation. By midday, Sarah found herself walking through a landscape unlike any she had encountered before. Here, the very ground seemed to pulse with a subtle energy that made her steps feel lighter, more connected to the earth beneath her feet. Crystalline formations jutted from hillsides like frozen music, catching and reflecting sunlight in ways that created rainbow patterns across her path. As she paused to drink from a stream that bubbled up from between these crystal formations, she noticed that the water itself seemed to hold a quality of unusual clarity and aliveness. Drinking it brought not just physical refreshment, but a deepening of the recognition that had been growing since her time in the sacred grove. The path led gradually upward again, winding through this crystal-studded landscape toward what appeared to be a plateau that shimmered in the afternoon heat. As she climbed, the air itself seemed to become more luminous, more alive with possibilities that she couldn't name but could feel in every cell of her being. Reaching the plateau as the sun began its descent toward evening, Sarah discovered a sight that took her breath away. Spread before her was a vast garden unlike any earthly cultivation she had ever witnessed. Plants of impossible beauty grew in patterns that seemed to follow the same geometric principles that governed the spiral of seashells and the unfurling of fern fronds. Flowers bloomed in colors that had no names, their fragrances creating symphonies of scent that seemed to speak directly to her heart. Trees bore fruits that glowed with inner light, and streams flowed in spirals that created standing waves of crystalline water that sang in harmonies too complex for human composition. At the center of this impossible garden stood a figure whose presence seemed to anchor all the miraculous beauty surrounding them. As Sarah approached, she saw that this being appeared sometimes as an ancient woman, sometimes as a timeless youth, sometimes as pure light that took no fixed form at all. "Welcome, beloved traveler," the figure said, their voice seeming to come from everywhere at once, from the singing streams and the luminous flowers, from the crystalline air itself. "You have journeyed far to arrive exactly where you have always been." Sarah understood immediately that she had encountered something beyond the realm of ordinary teachers, something that existed at the very source from which all wisdom flowed. Yet paradoxically, this ultimate teaching felt not foreign, but utterly familiar, like recognition of her own deepest nature, reflected back to her with perfect clarity. "This garden," the being continued, gesturing to the miraculous landscape surrounding them, "grows from the same awareness that looks through your eyes, dreams through your dreams, seeks through your seeking. Every flower here blooms with the same light that illuminates your understanding." As evening settled over the plateau, the garden's luminosity increased rather than dimmed, each plant and stream and crystal formation glowing with an inner radiance that needed no external source. Sarah found herself able to see more clearly in this living light than she ever had in ordinary daylight. The journey you have taken through all your teachers and teachings, the beings said as they walked together through pathways that seemed to rearrange themselves with each step, has been the journey of awareness, discovering its own nature through countless forms and expressions. They paused beside a pool, whose surface reflected not just their forms, but somehow their very thoughts and feelings, showing Sarah images from every stage of her journey, each encounter and recognition shimmering in the water like living memories. See how each teacher showed you the same truth through different doorways. The being observed as the pool's surface revealed Elias in his garden, Mira with her dyes, Kale in his temple, the village contemplatives, Lydia among her ancient trees, Theron beside his meadow fire. Each one was awareness teaching itself about its own nature. The pool's surface shifted to show not just Sarah's conscious teachers, but every moment of her journey, every encounter with natural beauty, every challenge that had deepened her understanding, every quiet moment when recognition had spontaneously dawned. Nothing you experienced was separate from this awareness that you are, the being continued. The very seeking that brought you here was awareness exploring its own depths. The very recognition that ends seeking was awareness awakening to itself. As they continued through the garden, Sarah began to understand that this place existed not as a location she had reached through travel, but as a dimension of her own being that had always been present, accessible not through journey, but through recognition of what never came or went. The seeds you carry, the being said, gesturing toward the canvas bag that still rested on her shoulder, contain not just the potential for future gardens, but the complete blueprint of this eternal garden that blooms forever in the heart of awareness itself. At the being's invitation, Sarah opened her bag and withdrew the various gifts from her teachers. The smooth stone from Kale's temple, the green fabric from Mira's dyes, the precious seeds from Elias's garden, each one now glowing with the same inner radiance that illuminated everything in this miraculous place. These were never just reminders of lessons learned, the being explained, as each object pulsed with living light in Sarah's hands. They were aspects of your own nature, external symbols of internal qualities that awareness possesses eternally. The stone dissolved into pure solidity, becoming the unshakable foundation of presence that could never be disturbed by changing circumstances. The fabric transformed into flowing color, revealing the dynamic beauty that awareness expresses through infinite variety, while remaining essentially unchanged. The seeds burst into immediate flowering, showing how every potential exists, complete and perfect within the timeless moment. This is the final teaching, the being said, as the garden around them began to expand beyond all boundaries, revealing itself as infinite space, filled with countless worlds and dimensions, all arising from the same source. There is no final teaching, because what you are has never been taught and can never be learned. It can only be recognized as what was never hidden. The garden, the being, the entire miraculous landscape began to fade, not into absence, but into a transparency that revealed its true nature as modifications of the same awareness that had been present through every moment of Sarah's journey. The extraordinary dissolved back into the ordinary, but the ordinary was now revealed as nothing less than extraordinary. Sarah found herself sitting beside a simple campfire on an ordinary hillside, the stars emerging overhead in their familiar patterns, a gentle breeze stirring the grass around her. Yet everything was completely transformed, not because anything had changed, but because the one who perceived had awakened to what she had always been. The canvas bag beside her still contained its precious contents, but now she understood that every object, every experience, every moment of seeking and finding had been expressions of the same awareness that was her essential nature. The journey had led exactly nowhere, except to the recognition of what had never been absent. As she prepared to sleep beneath the star-filled sky, Sarah understood that tomorrow would bring new landscapes, new encounters, new opportunities for this awareness to know itself through infinite forms. But the desperate seeking that had once driven her steps had been replaced by joyful expression, the anxiety of incompleteness by the peace of recognizing what was already whole. The fire gradually dimmed to glowing coals, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called to its mate. The same sound that had blessed her first night in Elias's valley, though now heard by ears that recognized all sounds as music emerging from the same eternal silence. The journey continued, but as celebration rather than searching, as awareness, delighting in its own infinite capacity for experience and recognition. Sleep came gently, bringing dreams that were no different from waking except in their recognition as dreams. And in the morning, when ordinary sunlight revealed an ordinary landscape, Sarah would rise and continue walking, not towards some destination, but as the eternal pilgrim who travels forever, through the landscapes of her own infinite being, coming home with every step to what she had never left. The morning light filtered through leaves that seemed to hold secrets in their veins, each shadow and golden shaft creating a tapestry of illumination that spoke to something deeper than sight. Sarah rose from her simple camp, her movements flowing with the natural rhythm she had discovered through countless encounters with those who had learned to work in harmony with time itself. The path descended now through valleys where morning mist clung to hollows like the dreams of sleeping giants. Each step carried her further from the high places where recognition had dawned, yet closer to something she could not name, but felt approaching like distant music, growing stronger with each mile traveled. By midday, she found herself walking beside a river that carved its way through landscapes of gentle beauty. The water moved with the same unhurried purpose she had learned from all her teachers, neither rushing towards some distant sea nor resisting the natural course that geography had carved for its passage. Along its banks grew willows, whose drooping branches created natural alcoves of shade and shelter. It was beneath one of these willows that Sarah encountered her next teacher, though teacher seemed an inadequate word for what she found there. An ancient woman sat weaving at a loom that appeared to have grown from the willow's roots themselves, her fingers moving through threads of light and shadow with the same fluid grace that characterized the river's flow. The woman looked up as Sarah approached, her eyes reflecting depths that seemed to contain the memory of every story ever told. "Welcome, child of the path," she said, her voice carrying the cadence of looms and spinning wheels, of arts that transform raw materials into forms of lasting beauty. "I am Thessa, keeper of the great weaving. You arrive at the moment when a new thread is ready to find its place in the eternal pattern." The loom before Thessa stretched beyond what ordinary vision could encompass, its warp and weft extending into distances that seemed to include not just the physical landscape, but time itself. Threads of every conceivable color and texture moved through her fingers, some bright as sunlight, others dark as the spaces between stars, all finding their perfect position in a design too vast and complex for human comprehension. "What are you weaving?" Sarah asked, settling beside the ancient craftsperson and watching the intricate dance of thread and shuttle. "Everything," Thessa replied simply. "Every story, every life, every moment of recognition and forgetting that has ever occurred or ever will occur. The pattern includes the thread of your own journey, from the first stirring of restlessness that set your feet upon the path to this very conversation we now share." She paused in her weaving to show Sarah a section of the great cloth where threads of familiar colors caught the afternoon light. "Here is the green of patience learned in gardens where seeds teach their quiet lessons about the proper relationship between effort and trust. And here, the deep blue of understanding that comes from working with materials that resist hasty transformation." Sarah could see in the weaving's pattern the essence of every encounter she had experienced. translated into the language of thread and color, tension and release. The cloth told her story more completely than she could have told it herself, revealing connections and meanings that had remained hidden from her conscious understanding. Each thread represents not just individual experience, but the eternal principles that govern all experience, Thessa explained, her shuttle moving through the warp with hypnotic precision, the thread of seeking that drives all journeys toward home, the thread of recognition that ends seeking by revealing what was never lost, the thread of expression that allows awareness to know itself through infinite forms. As afternoon shadows lengthened beside the river, Thessa shared the deepest secrets of her ancient craft. She spoke of how every thread must find its proper tension, neither so tight that it breaks under pressure, nor so loose that the fabric loses its integrity. She demonstrated how colors that seemed to clash in isolation created perfect harmony when woven together according to the pattern's deeper logic. "This is the teaching of the great weaving," Thessa said as evening began to paint the sky in shades that matched the threads flowing through her fingers. That everything belongs, everything serves the pattern, everything finds its perfect place when seen from sufficient distance and with adequate understanding. Sarah spent 3 days beside the river, learning not just the technical aspects of weaving, but its deeper implications for understanding existence itself. She discovered how individual threads, beautiful in themselves, gained meaning and purpose only through their relationship to the whole pattern. She learned how apparent mistakes in the weaving often revealed themselves as essential elements when viewed from the proper perspective. "The thread of your journey," Thessa observed on the final evening, as she worked a strand of golden light into a section of the pattern that seemed to pulse with a living radiance, "has been essential to the great weaving from before time began, not because of where it has led you, but because of what it has revealed about the nature of the one who travels." As Sarah prepared to continue her journey, Thessa presented her with a small shuttle carved from wood that seemed to hold all the colors of the rainbow within its simple form. "Remember that wherever you go, whatever you encounter, you are adding your thread to the eternal pattern. Every choice, every recognition, every moment of presence or absence contributes to the beauty of the whole." The path led away from the river through landscapes that seemed to shift subtly with each step, as if the very ground was responding to her transformed understanding. Hills became valleys, valleys rose into hills, and always the path wound onward with the same purposeful meandering that characterized rivers finding their way to the sea. As the sun reached its zenith on the day following her departure from the great weaving, Sarah crested a ridge that revealed a vista of breathtaking scope. Spread below her lay a vast city whose architecture seemed to follow principles she had never encountered before. Buildings grew from the earth like crystalline formations, their surfaces reflecting light in patterns that created a symphony of color and radiance visible from miles away. The city's inhabitants moved through its streets with the same flowing grace she had observed in her most enlightened teachers. Their daily activities performed with the kind of presence that transforms ordinary actions into expressions of the sacred. Even from her distant vantage point, she could sense the quality of attention that pervaded their community life. The path descended toward the city through gardens that seemed to represent the culmination of everything she had learned about patient cultivation. Here, plants from every climate and continent grew together in impossible harmony, their needs somehow perfectly balanced through understanding that transcended conventional botany. As she walked through these miraculous gardens, Sarah encountered their tender, a man whose presence radiated the same deep peace she had felt in the sacred grove. "Welcome, sister of the path," he said, his voice carrying the warmth of someone who had long ago transcended the separation between self and world. "I am Marcus, guardian of these transitional gardens. You arrive as the old cycle completes itself and the new cycle begins to reveal its nature. The gardens, Marcus explained, as they walked together through pathways lined with flowers that seemed to glow with inner light, served as a bridge between the ordinary world and the extraordinary city that lay just ahead. Those who approach the city must first pass through these gardens, where the recognition gained through long journey can settle into the foundation for a completely new way of being. Every plant in the garden, he revealed, had been placed according to principles that honored both its individual nature and its contribution to the collective harmony. We have learned that true community arises not from suppressing differences, but from understanding how apparent opposites can support each other when their relationship is properly comprehended. As evening approached and the city's lights began to twinkle like earthbound stars, Marcus invited Sarah to participate in the garden's twilight ceremony. Communities of gardeners emerged from various sections of the vast cultivation, each group carrying lanterns that cast warm light on the pathways between growing things. This gathering happens every evening, Marcus explained, as the gardeners formed a loose circle around a fountain whose design seemed to incorporate principles from every water feature Sarah had encountered on her journey. Not as obligation or ritual, but as natural expression of gratitude for another day of working in partnership with growing things. The ceremony consisted largely of silence, broken occasionally by simple observations about the day's discoveries or quiet expressions of appreciation for particularly beautiful moments. Children played at the circle's edges, while adults stood or sat in comfortable poses that suggested this gathering was as natural to them as breathing. "What you witness here," Marcus said softly as the ceremony continued around them, "is community organized around the recognition you have gained through your journey. When people understand their essential nature, they naturally create conditions that support everyone's flourishing without sacrificing individual authenticity." As the gathering gradually dispersed, with gardeners returning to their various sections and evening tasks, Marcus shared with Sarah the story of how this community had come to be. It had grown, he explained, from the recognition that ordinary social structures based on competition and scarcity could never satisfy the deepest human needs for connection and purpose. "The city you see before you," he said, gesturing toward the lights that now sparkled like jewels against the darkening sky, "represents what becomes possible when human community organizes itself around the understanding that individual fulfillment and collective harmony are not opposing forces, but complementary expressions of the same fundamental truth." That night, resting in a simple shelter that seemed to grow naturally from the garden itself, Sarah dreamed of threads weaving themselves into patterns of impossible beauty, of gardens that included every form of life in perfect relationship, of communities where the recognition of essential unity expressed itself through celebration of infinite diversity. When morning came, bringing with it the scent of flowers that bloomed nowhere else in the world and the sound of water making music as it flowed through channels designed by those who understood its deepest nature, Sarah knew that she stood at the threshold of something entirely new, yet as familiar as her own heartbeat. The path ahead led directly toward the city's gates, which stood open in permanent welcome to all who approached with hearts prepared by the kind of journey she had undertaken. But before taking those final steps toward whatever lay beyond the threshold, she paused to feel the weight and warmth of the shuttle Thessa had given her, knowing that she carried within it the power to add her own thread to whatever new pattern was waiting to be woven. The city gates stood before her like an invitation carved from living light, their crystalline structure humming with harmonies that seemed to welcome every traveler who had ever sought something beyond the ordinary boundaries of existence. As Sarah approached, she felt the familiar stirring of recognition that had accompanied each major threshold on her journey. Beyond the gates, the city revealed itself as a place where the impossible had become everyday reality. Streets flowed like rivers of polished stone, carrying pedestrians along paths that adjusted their routes according to each person's deepest needs, rather than their conscious destinations. Buildings breathed with the rhythm of living things, their walls shifting subtly to provide perfect light and temperature for whatever activities occurred within them. The inhabitants moved through this environment with the same natural grace she had observed in all her teachers, but here that quality had become the foundation for an entire civilization. She watched as a group of children played games that seemed to teach profound principles of harmony and balance through pure joy. She observed craftspeople creating objects of impossible beauty through techniques that appeared to blend ancient wisdom with understanding that transcended conventional limitations. "Every person here," explained a woman who introduced herself simply as guide, "has completed their own version of the journey you have undertaken. They have learned to recognize their essential nature and discovered how individual awakening naturally flowers into collective transformation." The woman's presence carried the same transparent clarity Sarah had encountered in the sacred grove, but here it was, expressed through engaged participation in community life, rather than withdrawal into contemplative solitude. We have learned that enlightenment without expression becomes stagnation, just as expression without enlightenment becomes chaos. As they walked through districts where each neighborhood seemed to specialize in different aspects of human flourishing, the guide shared how this extraordinary community had evolved. It began with individuals who had completed their seeking and discovered their essential nature. They found themselves naturally drawn together, not by shared beliefs or common goals, but by recognition of what they all were beneath the surface differences of personality and preference. As our collection of 500 stories draws to its close, let the wisdom you've encountered tonight continue to work within you, like seeds planted in fertile soil. These tales of patience and presence, of recognition and transformation, carry medicine for the restless heart and guidance for the seeking spirit. Sleep now, knowing that every story you've heard reflects something eternal within you, something that neither comes nor goes but simply is. May these narratives become doorways to the deepest rest, bridges to the most profound peace, and reminders that in every moment of stillness, all the wisdom you need is already present, waiting to be recognized like flowers blooming in the garden of your own awareness.